People like to believe that housing crises are modern problems. Asterisk, they assume this pressure. This anxiety, this quiet panic around money and shelter is something new. Something caused by recent governments, recent policies, or recent mistakes. It isn't what Canada is experiencing today, didn't start in Toronto, Vancouver, or even North America. It started centuries earlier, across the Atlantic. In Britain, long before mortgages had slick names, long before banks had apps, long before people believed debt was normal. Asterisk, back then. Land was not just shelter, it was power. If you owned land, you weren't just protected from weather, you were protected from uncertainty. You had leverage. You had options. You had a future that didn't depend entirely on someone else's permission. If you didn't own land, you worked. And if you worked for someone who did. Asterisk, this hierarchy wasn't hidden. It was openly accepted. Land meant status. Land meant security. Land meant control. For a long time, this system was brutally simple. But simplicity doesn't scale. And Britain was scaling fast. Asterisk, as trade expanded. Populations grew and cities swelled. Land became scarce where opportunity concentrated. Scarcity changed the game. Land stopped being just something you lived on and became something you could measure, divide, tax, borrow against, and trade. That was the turning point. Because the moment land became financialized, the moment it could be turned into numbers on paper, it stopped being neutral. It started behaving like a weapon. Asterisk, at first, ordinary people didn't feel the danger. Why would they? Asterisk, they still lived, still worked, still raised families. The system didn't collapse overnight. It evolved, slowly, quietly. Asterisk. This is where most people misunderstand history. They expect collapse to look violent, loud, sudden, but the most effective systems don't break people all at once. They exhaust them over time. Britain learned this early, as land concentrated into fewer hands. Governments faced a challenge. How do you manage growing populations without constant unrest? Force was expensive. Rebellion was unpredictable. Control needed to feel voluntary. The solution wasn't oppression. It was participation. Asterisk, people were encouraged to aspire, to work harder, to get ahead. Ownership was presented not as a right, but as a reward. If you worked enough, saved enough, behaved enough, you too could buy in. Asterisk, this idea was powerful because it felt fair. Asterisk, appear. But here's the truth that history makes painfully clear. Asterisk, when the price of entry rises faster than wages, effort stops mattering. And that's exactly what happened. As Britain industrialized, cities became engines of productivity. People flooded in for work. Housing demand surged. Instead of treating housing as infrastructure, stable, affordable, predictable, it was left to behave like a market. Asterisk, markets don't care about stability. They care about return. Landowners benefited. Builders benefited. Banks emerged as intermediaries, offering access to ownership in exchange for long-term obligation. This wasn't yet the modern mortgage, but the foundation was being poured. Asterisk, debt entered everyday life, not as a warning, but as a convenience, and convenience is always how the trap begins. By the time people realized they were paying more for less, smaller homes, longer hours, tighter margins, they were already inside the system. Leaving meant unemployment, instability, social failure. Staying meant survival, so they stayed. This is the moment housing stopped being about shelter and became about behavior. Asterisk, when people owe money for long periods, they behave differently. They avoid risk. They tolerate more. They become predictable. This isn't ideology. It's psychology. Asterisk, Britain didn't design this out of malice. It observed it and then optimized it. Wars accelerated everything. Conflict required funding. Funding required borrowing. Borrowing required confidence. Confidence required assets. Land absorbed the pressure every time. Asterisk after wars, debt remained. Inflation followed. Currency weakened. People rushed toward anything tangible. Housing prices rose again. Those who owned assets felt protected. Those who didn't felt desperate. This cycle repeated itself over generations. What's important to understand is this. Britain never truly fixed this system. It learned to manage it when housing became unaffordable for the working class. Reforms softened the edges. When unrest grew, policies stabilized things temporarily. But the core logic never changed. Asterisk land remained a store of wealth. Debt remained the gateway. Wages lagged behind both asterisk. This is why housing crises don't feel like emergencies at first. They feel like personal failures. Like you didn't save enough. Didn't work hard enough. Didn't choose the right time. The system prefers you to think that way. As Britain expanded globally, it exported more than flags and language. It exported legal frameworks, banking norms, property rights, and financial assumptions. Canada inherited all of it. Asterisk private land. Ownership, debt-based access. Housing as investment. Asterisk rising prices framed as success. Asterisk by the time Canada began forming its own identity. The blueprint was already in place. Housing wasn't treated as a public necessity. It was treated as a private ladder, climbable if you were disciplined enough. Asterisk this belief survived because it worked. For a while, asterisk early generations bought homes on modest incomes. Debt was manageable. Growth was slow. Stability felt real. That memory still shapes expectations today. Asterisk. But history shows us something uncomfortable. Asterisk systems don't stay stable once scale changes. Asterisk, as populations grew and capital concentrated. The same pressures Britain experienced centuries earlier began reappearing. Just with better marketing. Asterisk by the time modern banking arrived. The trap was ready. Mortgages didn't invent the problem. They perfected it. Asterisk's long-term debt turned housing into a lifetime commitment. Not just financially, but psychologically. People planned their lives around payments, careers around security, decisions around risk avoidance. Ownership no longer meant freedom. It meant obligation with prestige. Asterisk and prestige is powerful. People will tolerate immense pressure if it comes with social approval. Asterisk, this is why housing bubbles are so dangerous. They don't feel like bubbles when you're inside them. They feel like normal life. Asterisk prices rising isn't seen as instability. It's seen as progress. Homeowners feel richer on paper. Governments celebrate growth. Banks expand credit. The pain is invisible, delayed, dispersed, and normalized. Britain reached this stage long ago. Canada is approaching it faster. Asterisk, what most people miss is that housing systems don't collapse because people stop believing in them. They collapse because belief outpaces reality. Asterisk, when wages stagnate but prices rise, time becomes the enemy. Each generation must borrow more for the same outcome. Each correction hurts more. Each recovery benefits fewer people. Asterisk history doesn't warn you with sirens. It whispers with patterns. Longer commutes. Asterisk smaller. Living spaces. Delayed families. Permanent. Anxiety. Asterisk, these aren't cultural. Shifts, they're economic symptoms. Britain saw them, adjusted, managed, lived with them. Asterisk, Canada is just beginning to feel them with less margin for bad. With less margin for deaths, Ruby Kiss. Ruby Kiss, Ruby Kiss. Only Ruby Kiss, Ani Ruby Kiss, has the luxurious texture. Melzi Resex has the error asterisk, and here's the most important truth history teaches us. Asterisk, once housing becomes the primary store of wealth, it stops serving the people who live in it. It serves the system that profits from it. This doesn't mean collapse is inevitable tomorrow. Asterisk, it means the direction is set. By the time most people notice a housing crisis, the machine is already running perfectly. Asterisk, that's because housing systems don't fail when they stop working. They fail when they work too well. To understand why, you have to stop thinking of housing as buildings and start thinking of it as a financial process. A long one, a slow one, a deeply psychological one. The modern housing system is not designed around shelter. It is designed around debt duration. Asterisk, banks learned something crucial centuries ago. Short-term debt is risky, but long-term debt is stable. A person who owes money for 30 years does not rebel easily. They do not gamble their income. They do not challenge the system that feeds them. They protect it because it protects their payments. Asterisk. This is where the modern mortgage comes in. Asterisk, a mortgage is often described as a path to ownership. That description is incomplete at best, dishonest at worst. In reality, a mortgage is a behavioral contract. It shapes how you think, how you plan, how you tolerate pressure. You don't just buy a house. You buy into a rhythm. Monthly payments, fixed obligations, asterisk, long-term predictability, asterisk, from the bank's perspective. This is perfect. They don't need you to succeed spectacularly. They need you to remain solvent, just comfortable enough to keep paying, just anxious enough to avoid disruption. Asterisk, this is not exploitation in the dramatic sense. It's optimization. Asterisk, once this model was proven, it spread everywhere. Britain refined it. Canada adopted it. The logic stayed the same. Asterisk, here's where inflation quietly enters the story. Asterisk, inflation is often discussed as rising prices. That's the surface-level explanation. The deeper reality is this. Inflation changes the relationship between time and money. Asterisk, when inflation is low and stable, debt is manageable. When inflation accelerates, debt becomes a lever. Assets rise. Wages lag. Those who own gain distance from those who don't. Asterisk, housing absorbs inflation better than cash. That's why people are told to get on the ladder. It sounds like advice. It's actually a warning, because ladders move. As inflation increases, central banks respond. Interest rates change. Credit tightens. Payments rise. New buyers are squeezed. Existing owners feel protected until they aren't. Asterisk, this is the part most people misunderstand. Asterisk, banks do not want housing prices to crash. They also do not want them to stagnate. They want controlled growth. Enough appreciation to justify lending. Enough pressure to keep demand high. Asterisk, when prices rise, homeowners feel wealthier. This is psychological, not liquid. But psychology drives behavior. People spend more, borrow more, feel safer taking on risk. Asterisk, governments benefit too. Higher property values mean higher tax bases, more revenue without visibly raising rates. It looks like prosperity. On paper, everyone wins, except wages. Asterisk, wages are the slowest moving part of the system. They respond to productivity, not speculation. When housing prices disconnect from wages, a silent gap forms. That gap is filled with debt. This is how the middle class was shaped. Not as an accident, as a buffer. The middle class exists to stabilize consumption. They earn enough to borrow, not enough to escape. They own assets, but not enough to influence policy. They feel invested in the system, but remain dependent on it. This balance is fragile. When housing becomes the primary way families build wealth, everything else becomes secondary. Careers are chosen for stability, not fulfillment. Locations are chosen for affordability, not opportunity. Life decisions are delayed. Marriage, children, mobility, these aren't cultural shifts. They're financial responses. Britain experienced this earlier. The UK housing market became increasingly detached from income decades ago. Permanent renting became normal. Homeownership shifted from expectation to aspiration. Canada is moving faster through the same stages. Household debt levels rise. Down payments grow. Loan terms stretch. People accept conditions their parents would have rejected, not because they're weaker, but because the alternatives have vanished. And here's the critical insight history provides. The system does not collapse because people are irresponsible. It strains because responsibility is no longer enough. When inflation outpaces wages for long periods, discipline stops working. Saving becomes pointless. Risk increases. Speculation fills the gap. This is where bubbles form, not from greed alone, but from necessity. People don't speculate because they want yachts. They speculate because standing still feels like falling behind. The system encourages this quietly. Easy credit, favorable terms, cultural pressure, media reinforcement. Homeownership as adulthood. By the time caution returns, prices are already elevated. Corrections hurt the most recent entrants, the ones with the least margin. This is not a flaw, it is a feature, because every cycle transfers wealth. Upward, slowly, legally, invisibly. Those who enter early benefit. Those who enter late subsidize them. Those who never enter pay rent that supports the system indirectly. Banks earn interest regardless. Governments collect taxes regardless. The structure holds. Until it doesn't. The danger point is not when prices are high. It's when belief becomes absolute. When people assume housing can only go up. When debt feels permanent but acceptable. When alternatives disappear. History shows us that this stage can last years, even decades. But once conditions shift, the adjustment is brutal. Interest rate changes expose fragility. Job losses reveal leverage. Overextended households scramble. Confidence cracks. Britain learned to manage this with regulation, social housing, and cultural acceptance of renting. Canada is still emotionally invested in ownership as identity. That makes the pressure sharper. The machine doesn't care how you feel about. It responds to numbers, debt to income, ratios, interest sensitivity, asset concentration. These metrics are already flashing. And this is where psychology becomes dangerous. People inside the system defend it. They have to. Their security depends on it. Criticism feels like threat. Warnings sound like pessimism. This is why housing debates feel emotional, not rational. You're not arguing about policy, you're arguing about survival strategies. In Part 3. We bring this machine into the present, Canada, today. Now, we look at what history suggests happens next, not predictions, not fear, but patterns. The quiet kind. The ones that repeat because human behavior hasn't changed, even if technology has. Because once you see the machine clearly, you realize something unsettling. You were never meant to outrun it individually. And that changes how you listen to the rest of the story. By the time a system reaches maturity, it no longer announces itself. It simply becomes normal. That is where Canada is now. For years, housing was discussed as opportunity, a smart move, a responsible step, something you did when life was finally on track. The language mattered. It framed ownership as adulthood, renting as temporary, and waiting as failure. That framing worked until it didn't. Today, the average Canadian household carries more debt than any previous generation. Not because they are reckless, not because they are careless, but because participation now requires leverage. Renting no longer feels like flexibility. Buying no longer feels like security. Both feel like pressure. This is the stage Britain reached earlier, the stage where housing stops being a milestone and becomes a permanent psychological weight. The UK didn't collapse when this happened. It adjusted. Quietly, renting became normalized. Ownership became inherited rather than earned. Canada is moving toward the same equilibrium, but faster, and with less emotional preparation. Here's what history makes clear. When a society ties dignity to ownership, exclusion becomes humiliation. Young adults delay families not because they don't want them, but because the cost of stability is too high. Mobility declines. Risk-taking disappears. Creativity gives way to caution. This isn't laziness, it's adaptation. People optimize for survival inside the system they're given. And the system is now asking for more time. More debt, more patience, while offering less certainty in return. The older generation often doesn't see this. Not because they're blind, but because they entered earlier. Their experience was real, but it is no longer replicable. Housing that once consumed 3 to 5 years of income now consumes 10, 15. Sometimes more. History shows us what happens when this gap grows. Wealth stops being built through work and starts being transferred through timing. The winners aren't smarter, they're earlier. The losers aren't weaker, they're later. This is when resentment quietly forms. Not loud protests, not revolutions, just distance. Between generations, between owners and renters, between effort and reward. Britain absorbed this tension by normalizing long-term renting. Canada is still resisting that reality, emotionally, culturally. Politically, that resistance is expensive. Governments are trapped. Lower prices anger owners. Higher prices crush buyers. Any serious correction risks financial instability. Any inaction deepens inequality. So the system drifts, small policies, temporary relief. Careful language. History tells us this phase lasts longer than people expect until it doesn't. The breaking point is not price, it's confidence. When people stop believing the system will reward patience, behavior changes, spending tightens, risk shifts. Political pressure rises, not explosively, incrementally. The UK reached this stage. Canada is approaching it, and here is the part no one likes to hear. There is no return to the past version of housing. That version depended on demographics, cheap land, limited credit, and slower capital flows. None of those conditions exist anymore. Waiting for prices to go back to normal is waiting for history to reverse. It doesn't. What history does instead is rebalance. Painfully. Sometimes through inflation, sometimes through stagnation. Sometimes through generational reset. The most common outcome is not collapse, but adjustment. Lower expectations, smaller spaces, longer timelines. Stability becomes something you manage, not something you achieve. This is why housing debates feel exhausting. because they're not really about buildings. They're about identity, security, and the fear of being left behind. Asterisk, the system doesn't care about that. Fear, it only responds to pressure when it becomes unavoidable. Britain learned to live with that reality. Canada is still negotiating with it. Asterisk, and here's the final truth history offers.